to this training. Welcome to this training session brought to you by the Society of American Archivists, Archivists of Religious Collections section. My name is Mary Kenny. Today's topic is reference services. Before I introduce our presenter, let's review the disclaimer. The content in these presentations is for information only and is not legal advice. Our views do not represent the organizations where we work. We do not make any endorsements or guarantees. We are not liable for any loss or damage caused by your use of the content we provide. It is your responsibility to critically evaluate the content provided in the presentation or in any accompanying materials. You will not be able to use your microphone or video during this session. You can click on the closed captioning button at the bottom of your screen, and under Live Transcript, click Enable Auto Transcription to get closed captioning. There will be a question period after the presentation concludes. You should use the Q&A feature to ask your questions. We will not answer questions in the chat or unmute attendees due to time constraints. Please be respectful of your interactions. We expect you to follow the SAA Code of Conduct. This session will be recorded. Please fill out the short survey after the session ends. We encourage you to join the Society of American Archivists if you are not a member. We thank the Congregation of the Sisters of St. Joseph in Canada for hosting this webinar. And now, I would like to introduce our presenter, Nadia Nasr. Nadia is the head of Archives and Special Collections at Santa Clara University, where she oversees all administrative functions pertaining to the rare and unique materials held by the university library. These materials include the university's institutional archives, personal papers of individuals affiliated with the university, rare and special book collections, and, thanks to a newer collecting focus established in 2015, archives pertaining to women and theology in the Catholic Church, with a special emphasis on women religious. Throughout Nadia's 20-year career, she has provided reference services using archival, special, and digital collections. At SCU, the Norman F. Martin SJ Reading Room is open to the public on an average of 40 hours per week and responds to queries from both SCU faculty, staff, and students, as well as external researchers. During today's Lunch and Learn session, Nadia will provide an overview of reference services, covering such topics as the importance of reference services to an institution, critical considerations of allowing access, and methods of providing such services. Thank you, Nadia.
Thank you, Mary Kenny, and thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon for you. Barely just starting the afternoon for me out here on the West Coast. Please bear with me one moment while I set up my screen share and orient my monitors to make sure that I can see everything I need before I get started. All right, so I think I am good to go. So good afternoon. Thank you again so much for joining us for this Lunch and Learn session about reference services. Before I get started, I'd like to start today's session by expressing gratitude to the Ohlone and Muwekma Ohlone people. Santa Clara University occupies the unceded land of the Ohlone and Muwekma Ohlone people, who trace their ancestry through the missions Dolores, Santa Clara, and San Jose. We remember their connection to this region and give thanks for the opportunity to live, work, learn, and pray on their traditional homeland. Please pause with me for a moment of silence to pay respect to their elders and to all Ohlone people, past and present. Right. Thank you so much for pausing with me to express gratitude and pay respect to the Ohlone people. So although I've been doing reference services throughout my career, this is the first formal presentation I've given on this topic. And I actually struggled a little bit to determine, really where to start. There are some really solid reference texts out there that delve deeply into the specifics of reference theory and practice. To some extent, I'm probably going to touch on quite a few of the high points covered in those texts, but in the end, there's really no way I could cover everything in the time that we have together today. And it seems like it would really be more helpful and pragmatic to speak to you all through the lens of my own experience. Early in my career, I was the lone archivist and the first professionally trained archivist to hold that position. And over time, I gradually was able to add support staff who learned the ropes of fielding and responding to reference questions. And this, of course, have expanded more recently in my time here at Santa Clara, where reference services are a shared responsibility among department staff and students. So I'm going to start the session today talking a little bit about us and our context at Santa Clara University, and then toward the end of my presentation, try to talk a little bit more broadly about what may apply depending on the kind of institution you might currently be working at or might work at some point in the future. So a little bit about the services that we have here. On average, we field about 260 reference requests per academic year. In terms of methods of interaction, a majority of those are through email. About 20% of those interactions take place by appointment, where someone is coming in person to physically consult materials. 18% are walk-in, 8% is phone, where maybe we're just answering a quick question, either off the top of our heads or because we have ready access to that information. And then about 7% are via chat, Zoom, or other method. And I'll just say really quickly, chat and Zoom were methods of reference services that we provided primarily during the pandemic. We may continue the Zoom reference interviews, but chat was something that we really found not particularly useful outside of those pandemic circumstances. In terms of the services that we offer, as I said, we do in-person appointments. We offer duplication and image reuse services and in-depth research assistance on, particular topics where we have a breadth of materials to inform, whatever particular topic we may be assisting the researcher with. And then in terms of our outreach activities, aside from the in-person appointments, we host about 40 to 45 class visits from Santa Clara faculty who are bringing their students to use materials, and that averages out to about 750 people per academic year. We have annual summer exhibitions, and increasingly are making our material available online through our digital collections platform. So a little bit more in depth, but hopefully not too in depth about our context and the origins of Santa Clara. So the history of our university is deeply connected to Mission Santa Clara, which was founded on the banks of the Guadalupe River in 1777 by Franciscan missionaries from Spain. And I should say, the records from that period really reflect the Franciscans and the colonial Spain. And there's, although the sacramental records record the names of numerous individuals from the Ohlone and Muwekma Ohlone tribe, they really do not constitute cultural records of those individuals. Anyway, that was a quick aside. So Santa Clara was the 8th of 21 missions established under Spanish rule, and it's named for St. Clare, friend of St. Francis and foundress of the Order of St. Clare, as it was known after her death in 1253. And then in 1851, Jesuit Father John Nobley assumed administration of the mission church and immediate grounds to found Santa Clara College, which originally was a boys' preparatory school, later chartered for higher education beginning in 1854. And Santa Clara is the oldest operating institution of higher learning in the state. So our oldest archival collections are tied to the mission. They are the sacramental records and other materials generated by the Franciscans, which were inherited by Father Nobley. And there were also about 250 book collections. As I said, the manuscripts were generated by the Franciscans who ran the mission over 200 years ago. And because the mission church served as the parish church until the fire of 1926, the university has had continuous custody of these records. And they continue to record sacraments even after the college was founded in 1851. Our university records consist of the materials generated by early Jesuit and lay faculty and administrators at the college. There are records from the president all the way down through various administrative units and colleges and departments. And we have probably, after the presidents, our next biggest body of materials are the student records, which are permanently retained. Our most recent addition to university records are those of the Jesuit School of Theology, which integrated its administration and academic programs into the university around 2014 or 2015. Our rare and special book collections complement our archival materials and cover such topics as Jesuitica, nonfiction Californiana, 17th and 18th century theology, 18th and 19th century travel and voyage literature, early printed Bibles, and the heritage edition of the St. John's. And as Mary Kenny mentioned in my biography, since early 2016, we've been collecting or working with religious congregations to increase the visibility of their collections and also to preserve those materials, particularly for those congregations who are preparing for permanent closure. And as mentioned previously, it's part of a larger initiative and new collecting focus centered on documenting the vital contributions that women have made to the Catholic Church, particularly within women religious congregations in the West. And one other key element of this is that it brings balance to our largely male-centric Jesuit archives, and male-centric also because the university did not become a coeducational institution until 1961, so still relatively recent in our history. And then, so that was a little bit about our collections. Now I'm going to shift a little bit to talk about our facilities, and this will again frame, summarizing the considerations for reference services toward the end of my presentation. So in 2008, we opened it's such a long name, but the Harrington Learning Commons, Sobrato Technology Center, and the Oradre Library, which are all contained in one building. And there's a whole other side story I could go into about, donor relations and what happens with legacies and things like that. But the opening of this building formally reorganized the university archives and our rare and special collections into what we now call archives and special collections. Oops, sorry. We have quite a bit of material in our automated storage and retrieval system, which a lot of people call the book robots. And that storage area is a significant part of the building that we're in, and it's capable of storing millions of volumes and thousands of linear feet of material in a climate-controlled environment that contributes to preservation. Most of what we store in here are materials that don't need the special climate controls of our vault. And because, although they are in the building, they are remote from our office space and our service areas. So there is a bit of a delay when it comes to pulling materials from this particular storage area. And we share the space with the main library collection with a couple of others, so we're not the only ones who use it. But importantly for security, our materials that we do have in the ARS are stored in restricted bins that only we and those who administer that area have access to. So even though they're not as closely controlled as the materials in our vault, we are able to maintain some control and access, which is really critical, especially because our student records, which are considered confidential and restricted, are a portion of them we do keep in the ARS. So we want to be very mindful about who has access to those. We also have what we call our vault, which features more closely controlled temperature and humidity set points and controlled access that's expressly designed to store our archival materials as well as book collections, photographs, and artworks in optimal conditions. We have a secure dedicated elevator that only moves between our third floor office suite and our basement level. And it's a nice amply sized one to accommodate multiple book trucks and people. And then our vault, this is another aspect of security and preservation, is fitted throughout with zoned water sprinklers for fire suppression. Zone means that there's not water in the pipe and it doesn't dispense water until, dry pipe means there's no water in the pipe And zoned means that the water doesn't go off until there's heat in that area that actually warrants setting off the sprinklers. Oops. Our reading room is set up so that we can provide individualized in-depth research assistance to registered scholars in a dedicated research space. None of our materials circulate, so we need to offer some room for these materials to be consulted. We have the space to accommodate up to 16 researchers and often host class visits with upwards of 30 students. And then when our doors are open, our desk is staffed to ensure that researchers have reliable access to the materials during business hours. And then also on demand through email and electronic file delivery. So we have, as a quick aside, students who do, and we also do a good bit of work off desk to support those virtual remote requests. I mentioned earlier that we have about 40 to 45 class sessions every academic year. To some extent, that's been the result of outreach on our part, but also as new faculty are hired and come to the university with previous experience taking classes of special collections, we have found that faculty are reaching out to us, faculty that we've not met before, collaborated with, are reaching out to us to schedule these kinds of class visits. So in the beginning, we were doing sort of show and tell, often maybe one particular session, but these have become more in-depth learning experiences for students with course goals and learning objectives and things like that. And faculty are also creating assignments or other research projects for students that require them to come back and consult materials and use them in their research works. And I can imagine I don't have to tell you, all the keepers of the archives, how transformative those learning experiences are for our undergraduates. I feel like I get to live that almost every single day. And it's really wonderful. It's very time consuming, but it's also really wonderful. I learn a lot when I have the opportunity to participate in discussions with the classes, either in the reading room or through the online teaching modules that the faculty prepare, the discussion boards. It's really a lot of fun. And then as mentioned previously, we mount major exhibitions about once a year in our approximately 1,100 square foot gallery, which is adjacent to the reading room. Because of the high volume of classes that we have achieved in recent years, as well as the time consuming nature of mounting exhibits. If you've ever done an exhibit, you know what I'm talking about. They are worth it, but I've come to call them a beautiful time suck because they are very time consuming, especially in a space as large as we have. So we have been using our gallery as a classroom space during the academic year when we have a need of teaching space. There are other areas of the library we could do this, but those rooms we're not able to lock the doors and control access, and it's really a pain to haul all that stuff down on carts, plus all the support materials that you need, and then haul them all back up. So this seems like a much better, more accessible, manageable solution for us. So as I said, in the summer, we usually have a major exhibit. One drawback for all that work is that campus is very empty in the summers. So I don't know that we're really getting much bang for our buck, but it's where we're at for now. So, but it works out pretty well for the most part. And at the very least, we do have, materials in for community members who may come in, or also when you're doing orientations, and there are many parents and students on campus participating in those activities. And then finally, where appropriate and where there are no copyright or privacy issues, we've been increasingly providing online access to our collections, especially from our most useful and used materials, such as our student newspapers and course catalogs. To date, we've probably got about 50 digital collections with over 50,000 items. And we've achieved a significant portion of this volume of digital collections through mass digitization done by outside vendors. So we do have the capability to do that work in-house, but when we're working with really big bodies of material that we want to have digitized, we do contract with companies like Backstage Library Works or the Internet Archive to do a lot of that heavy lifting. And ultimately, they're able to deliver us essentially a collection that can go live when the work is completed. So that's been really terrific. And the other nice thing that I'll say, and this ties a bit into our student newspapers and course catalogs, which are among the most used materials. We've now, by having those digitized, can turn that into a self-service access kind of a situation for researchers that answers a lot of questions. So that, is a really great way to free our time up to focus on maybe hidden collections or, increasing our capacity in other areas, since we're not constantly answering over and over again the most frequent questions that can be answered with those digital collections. So that's been a huge help to us. So, oops, I got a little ahead of myself. So I'm going to pivot now and sort of explore a philosophical series of questions to talk a little bit about, hopefully provide some takeaways for you to think about as you either are currently offering reference services, or maybe you're finishing up school, or will go on to, to a new job and need to think about these things. So again, this is somewhat of a distillation from some of the texts that I'll have on a later slide for further reading if you're interested. But for starters, I would recommend this idea of knowing yourself. So what is the mission and purpose of your organization? Are you public or private? Are you an academic, educational institution? Are you in the corporate archives? What is the mission and purpose of that organization, and how do your archives contribute to that? Do you support teaching and research? Do you support, access to public records? All of those things that are good to consider and think about, as you think about the kinds of services that you are offering or thinking about offering. And then also, what is the scope of your collections? What are the subject areas? Where do your collections really shine, and what makes them distinctive and unique? And then also, what types of materials do you have in your collections? Are we talking about institutional records or government records? Are we talking about personal and family papers with photographs? Are we talking potentially about book collections? I think, although we have been trained in the profession of archivists to think specifically about paper records, paper documents, I have found I've increasingly been involved in, also because we have book collections, we really can't think of the two as mutually exclusive. And I think it's a topic for another lunch and learn, but I could talk about how even the books that are in Latin that I can't read, we really have this wonderful opportunity to think of books as artifacts and talk about things like book history or commercialism or other things. So there's a lot you can do with book collections as well. And also formats. Do you have digital records in addition to paper records, photographs, negatives, and slides? Do you have audio or video media as well? And then what kind of collections documentation do you have? Oops, I'm so sorry. My presentation is done, just kidding. My apologies, I'm working with many screens. So what kind of collections documentation do you have? Do you have just general narrative descriptions with sort of describing the broad scope of your collections? Or do you have more formal finding aids? Or are they something in between a general description and a finding aid, like a basic inventory or box list that at least helps you figure out, where you might need to go for a particular file? And then thinking holistically about your collections, do they have some kind of classification or organization system? So, for our institutional records, they're organized and arranged in such a way and assigned record group numbers that reflect the organization of the university. So, do you have something like that, or have you developed maybe something a little more subject specific? And then how do you communicate that information, about how your collections are classified or organized? And then also, are those, is that collection documentation only available in print? Do you have digital PDFs that can be popped onto the website? In our case, we're using ArchiveSpace as well as the library cataloging system. So what are the methods by which you're able to make that, information widely available? So that really relates to having intellectual control over your materials. And another consideration is, what condition are your materials in? Are they physically stable? And is there specialized equipment needed to access it? So, we have quite a bit of reel-to-reel audio as well as audio cassettes, Betamax, VHS, and DVD. So, you know, there's a lot of information often contained in those, but how accessible are they without that equipment? Another thing to consider is, you know, what is your capacity for services? You know, we're a department with 6 staff, and that makes it a lot easier to support those 45 class visits and 260 research requests. But if you're the only person in an archive, that could be pretty challenging. What subject expertise do you have, and where might you need to acquire more? How well do you know your collections? How much time do you have to devote to in-person services versus remote, or to external versus internal users? And then finally, you know, what facilities do you have for these services? Is there a dedicated reading room, or will users be in your office space or collection storage area? I've been in that situation at a previous workspace where the only place I had to sit down a researcher was in our collection storage area at a table. And then finally, you know, do you have materials stored off-site? Are they all co-located in one space or even in another part of the building? And how will that impact your ability to quickly retrieve and make materials accessible? So once you have a better sense of, you know, your organization and the scope of your collections and what services you can offer, it's good to also know who your users are. So are they primarily internal or external? So, you know, for us, our primary focus is on Santa Clara students, faculty, and staff. We also have community users who come in and use our material, and in a few rare instances, researchers who come from abroad even to look at materials that we have in our collection. And if your primary focus is on your internal customers, how do you prioritize the requests that come in from external researchers? You know, and another consideration about your users is, are they seasoned researchers who know exactly what they're looking for, or newbies, either newbies to archives, or maybe they're a seasoned researcher who are just beginning to dip their toes into a brand new topic. So there's a little bit of a learning curve. You know, other things to know about your users: how do they find you? What do they need or use the most? How much support do they need to find what they're looking for, even once they're actually physically looking, you know, at the materials in the collections? And one other really major consideration about your users is, how do they need to use or even reuse your collections? Is it for research? Are they working on a publication? Is this some kind of commercial reuse that then might have some other constraints, which I think is a good segue into our next slide, which is to know your rights. Maybe not you specifically, but your organization and rights, you know, pertaining to the collections themselves. So first and foremost, who owns and manages intellectual property rights? That would include copyrights, patents, trademarks, and trade secrets. And if your institution does not hold those rights, if they weren't transferred at the time of the donation, then you know, what is the impact of that on your users? Most institutions, as part of the registration process and agreements that researchers sign, the onus of responsibility is typically on the person reusing the material to ensure that they have the correct copyright permissions. There's also fair use for quite a few research purposes. There are some really good guides on how to determine when a use is reuse. And then also, you know, if this is not for research purposes or personal information purposes, and there are plans to reuse something commercially, you know, how do you charge a use fee for that or not? And then what kind of, we actually have an image use agreement form that's 5 pages long with all kinds of legalities that we use for our researchers, although we've been trying to move toward adopting Creative Commons licenses and their varying levels of what kind of designation you can use. So for example, the most generous Creative Commons licenses, you can reuse it any way you want. Other Creative Commons licenses say you can reuse it as long as you properly attribute. You know, we personally, for non-commercial purposes, want to see our materials reused as much as possible. So we try to reduce those barriers, and in particular, researchers also often are not getting money from publishers to pay for use fees or you know, copies of scans or, you know, whatever. And so we don't want to make we don't want to make publication burden on those individuals. So aside from the intellectual property rights, who owns the physical property rights? And that's has to do with the right of possession, of control, of exclusion, to derive any kind of income or to make decisions about how to dispose the materials. And that's often covered in a gift agreement that comes with a donation. Every institution that I've been at has a wide variety of documentation. Sometimes we have very clear property rights. Other times, I still even now get stuff in the mail with no return information, and there's an intent to donate, but I can't legally document that without someone to email the form to. So you want to think about those kinds of things and how that would impact your users, and if and how you can make certain things accessible when it comes to both IP and then again property rights. Another consideration as far as rights go is what federal, state, or municipal public records laws do or do not apply. If you work at a state, if you work at a federal, state, or city government entity, there will be laws about, there should be record keeping laws, and then also laws about how to make material accessible, from the archives, and those do apply. My last institution was a state institution, and so state law about archival record keeping and how to make materials or how to respond to Freedom of Information Act requests. We had to keep those kinds of things in mind. For the most part, I don't know that anyone was really, when it comes to like correspondence of a president from 150 years ago, less concerned about how to mediate access. But anyway, if you're a private institution or a corporate one, most government laws don't apply to private organizations. The one major exception is with student records. For institutions who receive any kind of federal financial aid, you are required to keep student records. And also, I'll get into this, and there are certain privacy laws that apply to those. In our case, well, one other thing about federal laws is also who invests the authority in your institution as not only as an archival repository, but also as the authority to dispense, copies of any kinds of records. In our particular case, the Santa Clara's Board of Trustees mandated the creation of the archives and invest us with our authority to be the permanent repository of institutional records. But where laws don't exist or compel, particularly with private institutions, there may be good reason to retain other records such as personnel files, financial documentation for tax or accounting purposes, but those are typically destroyed according to some kind of schedule established by the organization. And then the last consideration in relation to rights, probably overlooking a few things, but these are some of the major ones. What privacy and ethical considerations apply? So one main thing for us as far as student records go is the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. So that's a privacy law that protects the privacy of student education records and who can have access to that. And then also HIPAA, which is the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, that primarily applies to health plans, healthcare clearinghouses, and healthcare providers, and less so to archives per se who happen to maybe have a medical record of an individual. One exception for Santa Clara is that we have a campus student health center that does keep students' medical records, and so those for certain will be covered by HIPAA guidelines. And then, there are ethical considerations to keep in mind that aren't necessarily specified by any particular law. So just because you can make something accessible, should you? And that's always a good question to consider when we're talking about collections that may have very sensitive material. So one example that comes to mind is if someone was struggling with alcoholism and maybe wrote in a private journal about, their struggles. And so, that's not necessarily illegal to make that information accessible for the most part. But, these were human, if that person has gone on to pass, they were a human person, and we need to remember their humanity and I think act empathetically. And also they may have family members as well who are still living, who would be very embarrassed, or it may be very hurtful to have, that kind of private sensitive information known outside of the family circle. So that's always important to keep in mind. And then one other ethical consideration also comes into play with donor wishes. Sometimes we are working with living donors who have, concerns about the whole world having access maybe to a private journal. So there are instances I can think of where a donor has specified that, a certain portion of their collection, which contains their private journals, be restricted for a period of 25 years after their death. And it's challenging to not be able to make that accessible, but again, we are talking about human people and human dignity, and so it's important to move beyond complying per se to care and concern about these individuals. So always keep that in mind when you don't have clear legal guidelines, but there are ethical concerns. Always remember the dignity and humanity and act with empathy. So finally, the fourth sphere I think that comes to mind in regards to reference services is know your policies and practices. Policies can be centered on who can have access to collections and when, and if there are certain restrictions on who can have access, then why cannot those persons have access to those materials? How can your users access collections, especially when we're talking about internal versus external? When users can reuse material, or when can users reuse materials for research or commercial purposes, and what are the guidelines or implications of doing that? Do you charge some kind of a use fee, or is there some sort of use agreement that you want them to sign in the case of commercial purposes, where it allows them to reuse it this one time, but not forever, and not granting them an unlimited license to do whatever they want? Depending on what kinds of collections you have, that may or may not be a really huge concern. But especially if you need to get your general legal counsel involved, they may want to err on the side of restrictive more so than generous. So that can sort of slow things down in terms of reference and user services. One other question, which might seem like a duh question, but do your materials circulate? And part of the reason why I ask it is because I have been at a public library that has special collections, special book collections that they do allow to circulate. So you may just decide that you're going to have a non-circulating policy, but are there conditions under which you might loan materials to, say, a museum who is interested or putting together an exhibit? And do you loan original materials, or do you loan them a high resolution copy that they can reuse, for their purposes? And then do you allow copies to be made, and under what conditions, and not just like providing photocopies, but do you allow researchers to bring in, their own cameras or cell phones? If you do, that can actually save you a lot of time if they're able to make use of their own cell phone pictures, as opposed to submitting a formal request for reproduction of materials. That can save you time and save their researcher time. But if you are going to allow them to use cell phones or personal cameras, you probably would like to ask them to turn off their flashes. And also, this sort of gets more toward exhibits than using materials in a reading room, but we have had some exhibits where the curator has asked that no photography be done because they have produced, and it's very much within their right. They have their not so much the exhibit curation itself, but the narrative content that they prepared, which they had not had published, anywhere else. They had concerns about that, being improperly reused. So another thing to keep in mind, especially if you're borrowing materials or if you have guest curators or things like that. And then finally, other parameters around sort of policies and practices. How should your users handle materials, especially fragile ones? The sacramental records we have are recorded in bound volumes. Each sacrament is handwritten. We have microfilm of that, and then we also have those digitized up through 1850. So when do we allow people to access the original sacramental records, which those volumes are holding up okay, but the more that they're handled, the more wear and tear they incur. So are there times that you might want to make those accessible only to a limited audience, and why, and under what conditions? And are there going to be other times where you point them maybe to microfilm, or, since we have those digitized, you can point them to digital surrogates as well. And one example, very recently, we do use the sacramental records in classes from time to time, but one really meaningful interaction that I was able to have recently was to pull those sacramental records for descendants from the Ohlone and Muwekma So I think they might have just been from the Muwekma Ohlone tribe, but for them to come. So it was parents and their children to have access to those records where family members' names are found, and to learn a bit more about, the stories that can be told through those materials, in meaningful ways for them. So, so lots to think about. So that's kind of a whirlwind tour through Santa Clara's context, our reference services, and kind of for key points and considerations and sort of questions to ask and spheres of knowledge to know in terms of reference services. Last slide these are somewhat arbitrarily chosen by myself because I was familiar with them, but these are three texts on reference services that you may find helpful. Mary Jo Pugh's providing reference services for archives and manuscripts, I believe is out of print right now. It was from SAA's Archival Fundamental Series and published in 2005. And Cheryl Oistreicher's Reference and Access for Archives and Manuscripts, which has similar content to Mary Jo Pugh's text, but I think updates it, with more relevant information as reference and access services have evolved in the last 15 years. And it is part of SAA's Archival Fundamental Series 3. And then if you're looking for more particular case studies, there's Kate Timer's Reference and Access Innovative Practices for Archives and Special Collections, which actually wasn't familiar with. So I recently ordered us a copy to have for our collections, and I look forward to reading a bit more, learning more about some of the casebook or case studies that are presented in that text. So, so with that, I am at the end. And
Well, we do have questions coming in, Nadia.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, let me
Okay.
stop sharing, and then I'm happy to transition.
Okay.
One more moment. Bear with me while I toggle between screens. Okay.
Okay,
All
we've
right.
got 20 minutes for questions and answers, so this should go well. First question, Nadia, is how do you provide reference materials you may not be that familiar with?
Let's see. For a minute. Well, sometimes I'm not entirely sure if it's, or if you're asking a question about sort of the context of the materials or materials I've never handled. So I'll try to kind of get at both. I just do the best that I can. And honestly, if I have time to do a little background reading, I will do that. We've got quite a few reference texts about, various topics and subjects and, the history covered in our collections. So and honestly, if there's a good Wikipedia article, I will start with that. But I also find, I learn as much from the researchers and sometimes even the students who come in. Sometimes we might have a student, history student who will come in who knows all about California history, and we can really have a great dialogue. And I learn as much, from those interactions as, I might facilitate or help, the researcher who's asking the question. The other thing too is that this is where you're rich, if you have time to go and do more in-depth descriptive finding aids, and you could do some research and provide some more context for those collections, or someone else maybe prior to your time has come and done a really nice biographical or historical sketch that's part of your finding aid. And maybe even if you're really lucky, they've talked a little bit about why those materials are significant and not just what they're about. That can be really, really helpful. So, you really do the best you can. And as with many things in archives, I find that the learning process about your collections is iterative. And it ultimately is something that just comes with practice.
Nadia, we have another question, and this questioner says, you said that you have 6 staff. What is their role in answering reference and or division of work? Also, what reference management system do you use, if any?
Yeah, so we have 3 vacancies currently, but we do have 6 staff, and I'm the department head we are recruiting for an archives and special collections librarian, and that person is primarily in charge of scheduling our reference desk. That position and I share our instruction responsibilities, and that ANSC librarian is also our primary. What we've done up to this point is that person has been the primary person to field and respond to reference questions. With assistants, we usually have enough in our budget for 5 or 6 student assistants, and we do some training with them to so that they're equipped to field and respond to some very basic questions. So one example that comes to mind is, I mentioned that we have student records. We get weekly records requests from the registrar's office, and our students can handle requesting and pulling the materials from the ARS, preparing the scans. Before the pandemic, someone from the registrar's office would come over and make copies. Now they have a shared network drive. We're able to just scan and deposit a copy on that network drive, and no one has to leave their office. And, this brings to mind as well, one of the benefits I enjoy of being part of an academic institution is really robust IT support in a lot of ways. I'm also we're part of a larger library as well. So I have colleagues in other departments who can help with some of the technical aspects of, the behind the scenes work and cataloging. But back to the main core question. Again, our archives and special collections with support from our student assistants are the primary point of contact. I often am involved in helping to field some of the more in-depth research questions that come in. It's harder sometimes for me to handle the ones that come in from students who participated in classes if I'm not familiar with their class, but I do the best that I can. And the other staff that we have, in our department are, excuse me, one second, I need to get a drink of water. Our university archivist is also a vacant position, and that position is in charge of processing our collections, preparing finding aids, rehousing, performing basic preservation. And I would like to potentially involve that person more in reference responses, but it's tricky to figure out how to do the division of labor when you're not, covering the desk on a regular basis. Or really actively involved sometimes in instruction activities. We also have one full-time staff position in charge of digital collections. So they are the ones scanning, preparing metadata. We use Content DM to publish our digitized materials to the web. Let's see, I've got the head, archives and special collections, librarian, digital collections. Who am I forgetting? Sorry, I have to go down the road. We have an archive specialist who also helps with processing activities. So this is a lot of the behind the scenes cataloging stuff. And then we have our institutional repository coordinator, which is another digital collections platform, a person who's primarily focused on making faculty research available online in institutional publications. So, we, again, that archives and special collections librarian and I, they're the primary kind of point of contact. I help with reference and instruction. We sometimes will loop in our colleagues to help pull materials. In some cases, the other thing that's tricky too, we all help cover the reference desk as well. But the tricky part is if you're not involved in fielding and responding to reference questions on a regular basis, and your sphere of knowledge as a staff person is completely different. Can be really challenging and tricky for them. So they help us cover the desk in particular when we have gaps in coverage. But for the really heavy lifting, we have 2 or 3 dedicated people who do that. And again, some of those reference questions, if you have your course catalogs or most frequently, materials that can answer a lot of questions and you can make that self-serve, that can really help kind of free things up, which I know wasn't quite the vein of the question, but yeah, we do the best we can.
Well, Nadia, we do have some other questions.
Yeah, go ahead.
Someone asks, when students visit for the first time, what are some of the most surprising things they discover about archives and what archives do? Are they surprised they are allowed to engage with materials?
That's a great question. Usually the most common refrain is, wow, I didn't even know this existed. It is can be really tricky to, and I think that's the case here, and it was the case at my last institution. When they, and I'll say every student is a little different, and sometimes there's just no engaging them, and other times they just have a really good poker face and you have no idea what's happening until you see a discussion board or have a chance for a one-on-one follow-up. But they are generally really, really excited. Most of the time they think it's really, really cool and amazing. They're fascinated by, we have books that are 400 years old. They are fascinated by, sometimes just the beauty of the materials, how cool a historic photograph is or something along those lines. And they really have a lot of fun and have these really enriching experiences. And one quick example that I'll give from a class that I taught last spring was on Phyllis Wheatley in the context of Black Romanticism. And, we have a few of her texts, one book of hers, and then, some of her poetry submitted to various places. And then, other content where others are vouching for her abilities as a poet and saying, yes, we can attest that she, wrote these materials. And this light bulb moment that we had in the class discussion was, really about how much Phyllis and her work couldn't stand on its own merit. And, what we had in the affidavits and other things where others are attesting to her ability, it's like they were talking about her like she wasn't even in the room, which is something I think many of us could probably relate to. So it's really exciting for them. Sometimes they just think, when we do open house kinds of things, they just think it's really, really cool and maybe go along about their day. But, it can really help them make these new connections that, or spark, better understanding, or just enrich their learning experiences in ways, that it didn't. And I'll just say too, for myself personally, I never got history until I started working with primary source materials, which didn't happen until I was in graduate school. So, so I know, I try to give them the experience that we can have. And the other thing that's tricky about students knowing that we're here is, our student body is changing every 4 years. And, I think even more and more K through 12 educators, especially those who teach history, are trying to incorporate more primary sources. So I think that, maybe in another 5 or 10 years or so, we might have freshman students who are coming in with more awareness about primary sources and thinking about where can I find them, either, online or as part of. But the other thing that's tricky too is they don't even talk about the library in the course catalogs anymore. It's usually on the tour, but there's very little information about the library and how it supports those things. And we used to have at least a small paragraph for archives and special collections in the catalog, and that just doesn't happen anymore. So, you just do the best you can and you connect with the ones that you can. And I'll stop there because what I was about to say was less about students.
We do have a couple other interesting questions if we have enough time. This question is, what about remote reference inquiries where a person can't travel to the archives and be served the records?
Yeah, so we definitely had that happen a good bit during the pandemic. And, in as much as we can, we will offer increased scanning services, duplication services. And in fact, week before last, I fielded a request from someone who teaches Latin and who for the last 10 years has been looking for this one particular Latin dictionary that was printed in 1910, and there are very few copies. And I was able, it's out of copyright, it's in the public domain, and it took me probably add all the hours together, probably almost a solid day's work. But I scanned and emailed it to him. And yeah, so, again, so that's where, like, if you're in a position that you can digitize your collections and make them available online and make them self-serve, it's not the same as being able to consult materials in person, but it helps a lot. And one other thing that I'll say is we stopped charging fees for that.
Yeah, that's
mostly because I can't be bothered to generate invoices and make sure, it really, that's very time consuming. So we just stopped charging for it. And when people, researchers, who are used to paying such fees will say, I'm happy to pay any fees associated. And, if they persist after I tell them we don't charge fees, then I'll encourage them to make a donation for whatever it's worth to them. And then they usually ask me, well, how much would I have normally paid? So you can really generate a lot of goodwill. And I mean, I'm not talking about like millions of dollars, but, I think you can do a cost benefit analysis. Is it really worth it for you to spend all of that? Now, if it's for commercial reuse and someone wants to use it in a textbook, that's the one time I would say charge a fee, because you don't, because they're going to make money off of that, right? So
Okay,
yes.
I think we have time for one more question, if that's okay with you. Thank you for taking so many questions. Does the archive give instructional classes on how to use the archives to students on the campus? Yeah, so I'm glad someone asked that question. One of the things I've reflected on in these instructional activities is we're spending less time on, here's what an archive, there are a couple of classes where we've done more of what I think of as archival literacy instruction. And we're really focused more on helping them achieve learning outcomes and objectives and helping them successfully integrate and use these materials in their research. So, we may talk about a finding aid, but it's not the primary point of the instruction session. We talk about a finding aid as a tool, and in the, and really at their point of need, and less so sort of, giving them the rundown of, well, this is what an archives is, and these are finding aids, and here's why we create them, and here are the component. I don't say that to say that that's not important, but their eyes glaze over pretty quickly in a class session. And I think there's more to be gained from engaging them with the materials and teaching them, those archival literacy components at their point of need, than because it really kind of becomes a barrier to learning and engagement if they have to sort of jump through all of these hoops first. So it's a little bit backwards. And like I said, we do have some courses where we do that kind of traditional archival literacy instruction, but we're really, really focused on, just kind of helping them understand that primary source and figure out how to effectively use it, in their project or as part of their assignment and things like that. And so, yeah, I hope that answers the question. Yes, it certainly does. And this is a wonderful presentation, Nadia. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for their questions and their participation. So this session will be coming to an end. And thank you, Nadia Nasr, for your hard work and your excellent presentation. My pleasure. Thank you. And I think one of my last slide had my email address. If you do have questions, I welcome them. I hope you feel comfortable reaching out to me directly. And if I can answer it, I will. And if I can't, I'll try to point you in the direction of a resource that will help. Very good. Thank you, Nadia. Bye-bye.